Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Sunday School Dropouts podcast. We are so happy to have you here with us today. This is actually the part 2 episode with a guest that you will have already gotten to know a little bit, and we're really excited for today.
Yeah, I'm excited. If y'all have not watched or listened to Ashley Buckner's episode, that was last week, go back and listen to it where she talks a lot about her personal story of inside the LDS church, purity culture, childhood sexual abuse, healing from all of that. It was a wonderful episode. And today's episode is going to be amazing because we're going more into the therapeutic side of it. So I'm excited for that conversation. But before we get into that, I just wanted to mention again that the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery does have spring support groups that you can sign up for now. So if you've been looking for ways to connect with other people who are going through similar paths, coming out of a high control religion, working on, faith deconstruction, healing, all of that, support groups are a great place to do that. You can head to the show notes to get information there. You can go to the website, traumaresolutionrecovery.com. There's a services tab and you can click support groups, or you can head to our Instagram page, Trauma Resolution Recovery, and all the information is there.
Sounds good. And as always, just want to drop the quick disclaimer. We recognize that some of the topics we discuss in any episode may bring up feelings, emotions, and triggers that may require more processing or be too much to handle right now. So please always feel free to skip any episodes or parts of episodes and come back if and when you are ready. Our goal is to help you trust your own body and lived experience, so take what you need and leave what you don't.
Okay, so we have another listener story for you, and they were answering a prompt where we asked if you could tell your youth pastor, parents, or spiritual leaders something about the way that purity culture impacted you, what would it be? And this person said, I wish I could help them understand how harmful it was to me physically and mentally. I wasted a lot of time denying myself the emotional growth that comes from intimacy with someone you love. When I look back at the memories of my early sexual experiences with my partner, I remember the anxiety I felt instead of the emotional closeness. Those special memories are something you can't get back, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think grief is a big lens that I oftentimes look at a lot of this through. It's not that I think we can't heal and, definitely move through and process and heal from a lot of this stuff, but there is a certain element of there are years of your life that you're not going to get back. I think the best years can still be in front of us. Absolutely. But also, I get that. The idea that these are things that you can't get back, unfortunately. Like they said, I'm like, I hear that.
Yeah, I appreciate you talking about the grief piece because, trauma and grief are not the same thing, but they often go hand in hand. That grieving is so necessary, especially when we're talking about things like complex trauma, which I really believe that the impact of high control religion fits a lot of that complex trauma criteria because it is so pervasive. And to that end, there's just so much that you can miss out on that would have been maybe developmentally appropriate or things that were hijacked, like this person is talking about, experiencing anxiety instead of closeness. And I resonate with that, really having to rewire my brain essentially. But yeah, the grief piece feels really important of acknowledging that and knowing that it's okay to not have loved that was what your experience was and to miss out, grieve the things that you missed out on, including in sexual relationships.
We have some listener questions, and let's see what we have today. A listener asks, can someone be harmed by purity culture even if they weren't very religious?
I love this question. This is actually, I've gotten this question many times before on my social media, the Instagram, when I've answered questions. And I think the answer is yes. And I would say even like our guest, Ashley, today in last week's episode, she talks about that she got out of purity culture at a relatively early age, out of high control religion. And yet the impact was so deep. There's so many clients I work with that were just like very loosely a part of a church or a youth group that taught these things, but they wouldn't say I was super invested in it. Or maybe my parents, they didn't reinforce those rules. And yet years or decades later, they are still dealing with some of those messages. And I think part of it is because of just the repetitive nature and how those messages were drilled into you, and these expectations and the shame that came about if you didn't follow these rules, and that impacts a person's physiology. And so I would just say, even due to the subjective nature of trauma, I think, purity culture can be deeply harmful to anybody, even if you weren't particularly religious or didn't grow up in a religious home or didn't have parents who reinforced it. You just never know what messages will take a hold inside your body and have those long lasting impacts. What do you think, Andrew?
I mean, long and short of it, yeah, absolutely. Folks can be harmed by purity culture, even if they weren't very religious, even if they don't feel like they really grew up in it, because I can promise you, if you grew up in this country, you grew up in it. Especially, it's like where I grew up was the Bible Belt. Even the folks who weren't religious were still religious in a lot of ways without even, I think, fully realizing it. So yeah, it's a thing where so much of purity culture it's just like the air we breathe culturally, and I really can't overstate how pervasive it is. And so, yeah, I don't. I mean, I could get off into like some different tangents of all the nuance therein, but I mean, yeah, it is, I think, so much more pervasive than just things like I kissed dating goodbye and, the obvious examples, right? It's more pervasive than just that.
Yeah, I mean, I even think about this, in the early 90s when Bill Clinton was the president, there was a big push in public school education for sexual abstinence or abstinence until marriage. Like the sex ed curriculum was based off of that, which was deeply influenced by the True Love Waits campaign, which of course is connected to the Southern Baptist Convention and all of that. And so when we looked even like politically wise, like in our policy, this was public school policy, right? And you received funding for sex education if you agreed to abide by that curriculum, So of course it ended up in many public schools because they needed and wanted that funding, and that was the price. So even if you weren't a part of purity culture, like I think about when I grew up, I was in a very Catholic and Lutheran city kind of surroundings where they didn't have the same type of purity culture that I was in, being from a more mainline or, Protestant background. And so they didn't get it from church, but they did get it in school. And so I think that, there's, people that I will talk to even from my high school years that were not religious at all, and they still are very familiar with the messages of purity culture, and maybe not harmed to the extent that you or I may have been, but definitely can feel that guilt and shame still. So I think that's the insidiousness of purity culture. All right, we got another question. And it says, I'm afraid I only know how to be attracted to emotionally unavailable or controlling partners because that's what was normalized for me in church. How do I relearn what is safe and healthy? There's an easy one for you, Andrew.
Yeah.
Wow, this is a great question.
It is a question. And I mean, first of all, I just want to start like the glass half full side of things. The fact that you even recognize that might be a pattern that's going on is huge, because I mean, a lot of us do gravitate towards relationships and dynamics that we are familiar with, even if they're causing us harm at the same time. It's a paradox, but it is kind of a thing that we notice, especially with trauma and relationship dynamics. But to the question, how do I relearn what's safe and healthy? It sounds like such an easy answer, but I truly therapy type work. I would imagine the person asking this may very well already be doing that, and they're asking maybe more specifically how to start doing that. But yeah, I mean, I just can't overstate therapy. I really think body-based stuff is great. Somatic experiencing, EMDR if appropriate. I say if appropriate, that's again because everybody's different, but I say all of that because we're talking about learning what's safe, what feels safe. There's a lot of nervous system work there that's happening that we may not be conscious of, but it's happening whether we're conscious of it or not. That's the whole thing. And I think just starting to really work on what does feel safe, what does not feel safe, learning to be in touch with our bodies, and depending also upon where you are in the relationship spectrum of whether you're seeing somebody or not. Like, I would honestly see if they're willing to do couples therapy, even if you're not, even if it's just not that serious of a relationship, or not, if they're willing to do that, that's a big green flag. And also I think that could really help, because I do also think that there is a lot of value to be unpacking and working through some of these things in the context of a safe relationship rather than just individual therapy work, if that's possible. I realize that is not always possible. So I say that with a big old asterisk attached to it. But those are my initial
Yeah.
thoughts at any rate.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I liked what you said about like the safety piece. I'm thinking back even on like my own life, because that was definitely something for me, moving from a high control religion to a high control relationship and not really being able to see red flags because it was what I was used to, right? And so when I think about like how did I like what were some of the most effective ways for me in that healing process, that the nervous system work, starting with like beginning to find and create internal safety. So finding safety within myself, stability within myself instead of seeking it from external sources, having some internal coping skills. I think for me, that was the biggest game changer of how does like then being able to have healthier relationships. The other thing I think that's important is when we're talking about emotional unavailability or not wanting to be attracted to emotionally unavailable or controlling partners is you can start that work in your own relationships as well. It doesn't even have to just be romantic relationships. It's like, how am I showing up for the people in my life? How are they showing up for me? Can I start practicing some different relational patterns, whether that is learning how to repair after conflict or rupture, how to communicate, how to be patient with one another, how do we compromise, what are boundaries like in relationships, right? And so I think skills that we might be able to use in a romantic context could also be showing up in other relationships as well. And it's also not lost on me that there's a lot of times where if you're coming out of a high control religion and or relationship, some of your friendships might also be demonstrating those same qualities. So looking around to see like, are these relationships that I can show up as myself, where we can repair after conflict, where we can communicate, where we can like work through some of the messy stuff imperfectly, but still work through it nonetheless. And then, getting used to that, like so much of that is like building a new familiarity or a new baseline of normal. And once you're building that, you can translate that also into any other relationship, including romantic. And so, yeah, I would say that nervous system work is really important, internal safety. And then what can I do in practice, even if I don't have a romantic partner or maybe a romantic partner that's not willing to do this with me, could I practice it with other people in my own life? A therapist or a coach could be a really great person to practice with. But if you don't have access to that, or that's not something that interests you for whatever reason, look at the people around you to start relationships with and try to do things in a different way. So yeah, that's where I might go with that.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. I was actually just thinking another resource too, in terms of just to give a concrete example of something that can help with healthy assertive communication, but nonviolent communication can be a very accessible. It's just a very accessible framework. It is a book, so you can get that pre-owned pretty cheap these days. Yeah. But you even just Google it. Even just looking at the little PDF template you can find on Google Images is better than nothing. And I think it's a really good way of like that can help promote active listening, I statements, and advocating for your needs while also being collaborative. And which is I think important for doing the work of repair. Like everybody wants reconciliation, but most people don't want to do the difficult work of repair. And to be fair, most of us weren't given the tools to know how to do that. So
right. It's a skill to be learned for sure. No, I like that. I will make sure to put the nonviolent communication book and PDF in our show notes if people want to access that. But great questions, y'all. Ashley Buckner is a licensed marriage and family therapist and a certified brain spotting practitioner. Raised in an unorthodox Mormon community and a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, Ashley specializes in helping people understand the impact of purity culture, especially on childhood sexual abuse survivors.
Through her own journey of leaving religion and finding healing in community and body-based therapy, she supports clients navigating similar experiences. Ashley's work emphasizes that healing is possible and focuses on trauma-informed care that integrates mind and body.
Welcome back to the Sunday School Dropouts podcast, Ashley. It's so wonderful to have you here for a part 2 of your episode. Yay!
I feel so special. I get 2 parts. Thanks for having
me. I know. Yeah. So if you have not listened to the first part of Ashley's interview, Go back and listen to it. It just dropped last week. Ashley, we spent the first part of Ashley's episodes talking about her own personal story growing up in Mormonism and Mormon purity culture, healing, all those fun things. And we're going to spend a little bit more time today talking to Ashley about purity culture in Mormonism, some of the system specifics, what does healing look like, all of that fun stuff. So let's kind of dive into it and talk more about what makes Mormon purity culture kind of distinct. So you've talked about it having kind of its own flavor. And so what are some of the specific teachings or norms that make Mormon purity culture distinct from maybe like evangelical purity culture?
Absolutely. I would say in terms of the doctrine around keeping the law of chastity and being morally clean, I would say they're fairly similar to,
Yes.
purity culture in general. I think what makes Mormon purity culture a bit unique, however, is the generational history associated with the religion. So we have a religion that was founded on child brides, essentially, older men marrying very young women, and also the polygamous history as well. And I think from a generational trauma standpoint, sexual purity has been a little bit interesting in the sense like you must remain pure, and then if you can't remain pure, then we're going to get married and it doesn't matter your age, right? Like that's kind of like been a normalized process of young girls marrying older men. And so I think because of that element, like you just get married, we see a lot of people getting married extremely young in this culture. But I would say also generationally, the religion has very much from its inception normalized that women are responsible for the thoughts of men. They don't have a role aside from being a wife and mother. And also, I would say like sexualized violence was very normalized from the foundation of the religion. So I think that gives Mormon purity culture a little bit of its own flavor. And then I think in the same breath, I know all religions have this like confession element, right? Where you confess your sins. In Mormonism, it's a standardized practice. So from the time you're 8 years old, you have formal meetings with a church leader that ask you questions about your sexual behavior. And sometimes the sexual behavior questions don't get asked until they're 11, but a lot of times they start at 8 years old too. That's like a whole other conversation in and of itself, right? So this policing of moral cleanliness is done in a very standardized way that I think when in some other congregations, it's not as standardized. Does that make sense? That makes it a bit unique, right? Where it's like every member is going to go sit down with their church leader and be asked a list of questions about if they're keeping the law of chastity and if they're being morally clean, and they do that until they're no longer until they die, essentially, because that's how you maintain good standing in the religion.
Interesting. I know we're going to talk about the impacts of that in a moment, but I feel like we need to hit on the fact that like it's sexual grooming, right? Like in any other context, a grown adult man, certainly one that is not related to you, and certainly one that is in a spiritual authority, like a position of spiritual authority, right? That can help determine your eternal destiny. Asking you graphic, explicit questions about your sexual behavior is grooming. It just is. Like it's grooming at best, sexual abuse at worst, right? Like,
absolutely.
And I feel like it's worth talking about that. I don't even know if I have any specific questions other than like, it needs to be on the table,
And what's coming up for me as you say that, the religion is built on grooming. Girls were groomed to get married at a very, very young age, and it was normalized behavior. So and I think this practice has been in the practice of like policing people and making sure they're doing everything right has been around since the inception. But I think that's what makes it a little bit unique. And also too, there's a lot of practices in Mormonism that are very secretive that you don't talk about ever, like the temple. And there's a lot of things that go on in the temple that people don't even know what is because they're not allowed to be talked about. And I think that there's also been parts of that have been very sexual and purity in and of themselves too. So it's very much grooming. I think grooming is a good word.
Yeah. Because I mean, yeah, it just feels so inappropriate to be, having those conversations, tying your salvation to it. And then I know you've said this on your Instagram before too, but like also then teaching you to really dissociate or diminish any signs of discomfort, or you're just supposed to like bypass all of that. Tell the bishop the thing, or, go through the temple and, oh, it's okay. Right. And like, it does a lot to disembody, but it also does a lot to then continue that grooming behavior, which can lead to much more overt sexualized violence later on.
Absolutely. You don't listen to any warning signs within your system. You're taught not to.
Yeah. Ugh, so dangerous.
Yeah. So we just touched on that just a little bit, but very specifically, I want to ask, like, what do you see, like even professionally, clinically, like what do you see as the like short and long-term impacts of these behaviors on like people who grew up doing that? Because we've established, that sounds like grooming. It is grooming. But what are the long-term impacts of that?
Oh, I think there's a lot. I think the first thing that there's a lot to talk about right here.
Fair.
I like the first thing that comes up for me in working with this population and so many clients is like a complete lack of self-trust and trusting their own instincts. Right. They like, and also not having autonomy over themselves. And so can I actually make this decision? Is this the right decision? I don't even know if this is a proper decision or not. Am I right? Am I wrong? A really low tolerance for uncertainty. I think and then specifically in the purity realm, I think we see people getting married very, very young to partners that I don't know if they would have chosen if they would have had age appropriate developmental like dating courtship, right? That doesn't happen a lot. I think it also leads to people getting into situations that they don't actually consent to. And so they maybe reveal and share things about themselves because they feel they have to instead of it being appropriate for them to share. I think it creates long-term issues with shame and, again, that like distrust of the self. And also a lot of disembodiment, like Laura already touched upon. I'm trying to think of another thing that's really common. I think there's just a lot of unnecessary anxiety and scrupulosity as well, because you're like trying to follow the very strict purity rules. And then you're going to be asked about these very strict purity rules. And it's just like this perpetual cycle of anxiety. And I will also say that these interviews specifically there's a lot of trauma and distress associated with them. So I work with a number of clients and we'll be processing something that's not related, but it hits that same anxiety thread or that same shame thread. And then they're like, oh my gosh, I'm standing outside my bishop's office, or I'm in my bishop's office right now and he's asking me questions about my body, right? So it lives and I think it lives a lot of times unconsciously because it's not safe to say that's inappropriate.
For people who don't know what the law of chastity is or what types of questions might be asked in an interview by a bishop, do you feel like okay to share some of what that would be?
Yeah, absolutely. So we could pull up the specific questions on the church website, but I know
Oh my gosh, there's specific questions?
Yes. So
Oh wow.
But the thing is, like, a lot of times bishops will deviate from those questions. So I believe they're really only supposed to be like, do you keep the law of chastity, meaning are you having sex outside of marriage, right? And are you morally clean in your thoughts and actions? So you're not thinking impure thoughts or doing impure things like heavy petting, touching, right? Any sexual behavior. I don't know if the list actually gets more specific than that. However, because these bishops are just like men that are called from the congregation, they don't have like a formalized training process. They will ask questions about masturbation and they will ask questions about like explicit sexual behavior. So a lot of times if you confess like, oh yes, I had sex with my boyfriend, it's like, well, okay, did you orgasm? What was it like? It gets very explicit. So, but as far as the standardized interviews, I believe it's just like I think they do also ask about masturbation, and that goes under the moral cleanliness. But the list also covers like, do you pay your tithing? Like there's all these requirements to be worthy for your temple recommend. But they are available on the church website.
Wow. Okay. Might have to look those up.
So if anyone wants to go check them out.
Yeah. I'm like, if I do that, am I going to start getting like Mormon, like advertising on my Instagram or something?
up before. I've looked them up specifically. So I know the moral cleanliness and thoughts and actions is as well as the law of chastity, meaning sex outside of marriage.
Are there rules around pornography, like especially for men?
Yeah, that's not being morally clean in your thoughts and action.
Okay. Yeah.
So pornography, like, so you're not supposed to watch pornography. You're not supposed to masturbate. Obviously, like the only thing that's allowed is like a kiss. There's no like outside and like hugging, obviously, but outside of that, no other sexual behavior is allowed. It's all sin.
Wow. Okay.
One thing you mentioned, I just want clarification on this. You said these are just men from the congregation. In other words, these are not trained clergy?
Not trained clergy.
Okay.
Basically, Mormonism is ran by a bunch of volunteers. I do believe that like the highest, like the apostles and like the high guys, the leaders of the church, the prophet of the church, I do believe they get some sort of money. I'm not exactly sure. But the way it works is there's a spiritual revelation for a member in the congregation, and they have to be a worthy priesthood holder. So they have to be able to answer all those questions, right? And they have to be a male, and they have to be a priesthood holder. Like they have to hold the highest level of the Mormon priesthood, and then they can be called into a leadership position. And then when they're called into, and so they could be a banker, a plumber, a garbage man, a mailman. It doesn't matter. Anyone could be called into this position. They're called by the power of discernment. They're given a handbook of like, here's what you're supposed to do. And that's basically it. I think there might be an online training now, but there's no background checks. I think some states are requiring background checks, which I think is wonderful. Like I think California requires background checks. I know the UK requires background checks now, but that's not standard of care. And there's no oversight. No, they're just lay people that are called into these positions. And bishops, and I will say this, I actually have a lot of compassion and empathy for LDS bishops because they are placed in impossible situations to support their congregation. The congregation you're encouraged to go to your bishop for everything. So not just your sexual sin, like your marriage problems, your finances, like everything you go to the bishop for. And I think it's really unfortunate because these men are given no support for what they're asked to do.
Yeah.
Wow.
This was not a question that we prepped you for, but I'm just thinking about our conversations about the recent docuseries that came out, Surviving Mormonism, that Heather Gay hosted. And they talked a lot about like the position of the bishop and what they are hearing from people, really how they're also tasked with protecting the church, the institution, especially over a person, even in cases of childhood sexual abuse. And yeah, I wonder if we can just talk about that a little bit. Of course, in the show and even in interviews after, there's these bishops who are like, hey, these things were disclosed to me. I was told to call a hotline. That hotline actually didn't go to like Child Protective Services. It went to the LDS lawyers, and they told me I didn't have to, report anything. And yeah, can you speak to that a little bit?
That's absolutely very, very real. So there's I've seen a picture of a manual for it. I believe they actually showed it in Surviving Mormonism.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
But so the standard is if a bishop learns of any child abuse or domestic violence or anything happening, they do not call authorities. They call the church's hotline. The church has a hotline for bishops. And actually that hotline is linked directly to the church's legal team, which is Kurt and McConkie. They give legal counsel on how to address it. And a lot of the church apologists will say, well, they're just making sure because clergy privilege, right? So there's this caveat that if abuse is disclosed to a clergy member in certain states, they don't have to break that privilege. And in Utah being one of those states, other states don't have the same rule. So they will invoke clergy privilege and they'll say, no, you don't report it. And the problem is the users do not get reported then, and they continue to have access to their victims. And unfortunately, this is come out in so many cases and in so many circumstances that this is, I would argue, the standard of care.
Yeah. Yeah. And the thing is, like, I know that this happens outside of the LDS church as well.
Absolutely.
So I don't want to just like single them out, but I think we're seeing it more overtly just with like docuseries and things like that. But it really, like, the church values so much, not only protecting itself and the institution of the church, but they also value redemption so much, so like follow our path of restoration. and then you can be redeemed back into the church or positions of leadership. And that is valued over the actual victims that these crimes, not sins, but these crimes are committed against.
And I think that really goes into the purity culture realm, because I have read hundreds and hundreds of stories of survivors going to their bishops to confess this abuse and them being told it is their fault and asked what were they wearing and what did they do to provoke it. And then I've read stories where survivors have been told to write a letter of forgiveness to their perpetrators. I mean, it's so traumatizing. And again, like, it highlights the purity culture element and also how that bleeds right into abuse.
Yeah. Wow. Well, that is definitely something that I think folks in other denominations unfortunately can relate to as well. I mean, obviously some of like those interviews and whatnot, that's a very uniquely Mormon thing, but the institutional enabling of predatory behavior and covering those up, like, unfortunately, like, I have lost track of how many individual stories I've heard from folks I either know personally or have worked with directly. But I want to ask though, as far as like specific pieces about Mormonism that make it unique, how does the theology around things like eternal marriage, temple worthiness, modesty shape how people, especially girls, view their sexuality?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. I think, so because in order to get to the highest level of heaven, the celestial kingdom, you have to be married in the LDS temple. And once you are married in the LDS temple, you wear what's called Mormon garments, or I don't know, LDS garments. Mormon is not a proper term anymore, but I try to be aware of that.
Yeah.
So you then that has then you are only allowed to wear very specific clothing around that. And I think for a lot of women growing up in LDS culture, that modesty standard that stems from the LDS garment is applied from the time they're very, very young, right? So they're wearing garment friendly clothes before they're ever wearing LDS garments. And then once you do go through the temple and you are supposed to be wearing your garments, it becomes very much like that virtual signaling and like the garment checking and who's wearing their garments. Oh, she's not wearing her garments, right? So very much that if you're not covered up properly, you are not you're not embodied in the religion. You're not close enough to God. You're causing impure thoughts for men.
What is the recent kind of changes to the garment rules? That was all over social media and whatnot not too long ago. And I think it was something about shoulder exposure. What was that about?
Yeah, absolutely. So the garments have actually changed a couple times. So they used to be like full sleeve length.
Oh,
so
wow.
if you're familiar with the fundamentalist LDS church and they wear the long dresses, that's what the garments used to look like. And I believe FLDS still wear garments like that. And so then they changed to like cap sleeve. And I don't know when the change happened historically, but I do know when this one happened because we're in the midst of it. So then they recently changed and it dropped last October and they changed to tank top sleeve. And it was only for people living in hotter climates, I think always with the intention that it was going to come to Utah. And so then like a lot of Mormon influencers started getting their hands on the garments and it kind of blew up and it came to Utah. And I think that the problem with Mormonism is they believe in modern day revelation and that
convenient.
Their church leader believes that the prophet of the church can really receive messages and revelation from God. And so it's like there's all these rules and changes and it's like, well, God kind of changed his mind, right? And that's how it was too, like when the black people were given the priesthood, they weren't allowed to have the priesthood until 1970. It was because the prophet had a revelation from God that they could now have the priesthood. At the same time, they were trying to like there was some rule that had to pass. You know what I mean? Like it was right during the civil rights movement. So it's like interesting timing. But the problem is there's a whole generations of women who were never allowed to show their shoulders. And like I work with so many women who still who are deconstructing, have been out of the church for years, who still get so activated by when they put on a tank top. And the problem is the church just makes this change and then doesn't acknowledge it and doesn't acknowledge the impact and the harm it caused. It's like very similarly to what happened in the 1970s. They don't talk about the impact the racism had on members of the church. We just like skirt past it. And that's just so on brand with the culture, unfortunately.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That is so convenient to have
convenient.
updated revelations. How nice. Andrew, did you guys have that in the Seventh-day Adventists? Like basically, updated revelations?
Well, as far as like prophets go, I mean, there's of course Ellen White. In theory, I think the spirit of prophecy can show up elsewhere, and then there will again hypothetically be more prophets, possibly, or something like that. But it just conveniently never happens. And she's been dead since 1915.
Yeah, I was gonna say, we were always told God's word never changes, so therefore it's always interpreted in the exact same way. How it can be applied might be different, not always, but could potentially have some differences in terms of application, but the interpretation of it never changed. So updated revelations, and they say the gift of prophecy is like a dead spiritual gift. They don't really have it anymore. And I'm just like, oh, okay. But yeah, that's why I actually struggle sometimes with more progressive forms of faith, because I'm like, true, quote unquote, true version of this faith is actually to be that fundamentalist all the time. It's hard for me to get on the progressive bandwagon because it doesn't really connect with this idea of God's word never changes and it's always interpreted in one single way.
Yeah, absolutely. And in Mormonism, you believe in the King James version of the Bible, but as far as it's translated correctly, and in it, there's a bunch of annotations that Joseph Smith made.
Oh, good.
So that's included at the bottom, right? It's so fascinating. And what's also coming up for me too, I think in how purity culture, in the LDS church, there's a verse in the Doctrine and Covenants, which is a Mormon doctrine because obviously polygamy was outlawed. That was another revelation. But there's a doctrine in the Doctrine and Covenants that says that when men and women die, right, and your husband in heaven wants to take another wife, and if you don't support it as a woman, then you're cast out. So
wow.
Mormonism believes in polygamy in the afterlife. They don't like to talk about it, but they absolutely believe in it. And if women do not get on board with it, they are cast out.
So being supportive of polygamy is literally a salvation issue for women, is what I'm hearing. Damn.
Yep.
Yeah.
But they don't talk about that very often. That's a very hushing. Yeah. Obviously, there's so much. I don't know what the church apologists say about it because I don't dive into all of that, but it's fascinating the gymnastics that will go into justifying a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I know that I'll preface this with, I recognize that in so many cases, purity culture does harm women more than men. And it was made by men to benefit men in most cases. But I also recognize that, men don't get out of it unscathed either. And so I'm curious too, specifically to purity culture as it shows up in the LDS church, how would you say it negatively impacts men?
I think that men and women are both impacted very significantly in different ways. I think so many men, unfortunately, have so much shame about their body, and they've never learned about their penis, and they've never learned about masturbation, and that is sinful and you're not supposed to do it. And I think it creates a lot of deviant behavior, not even sexual violence, but where they're doing things in secret and they're hiding things. Porn addiction is this huge issue in Utah, and I actually don't even think it's a real addiction, right? But it's they are abusing it because it's a coping skill for the way that they're not allowed to understand their body. And I think that it creates a lot of emotional immaturity. I think also men have a lot of things shoved down inside of them. They're not encouraged to say things out loud. And then I also think on the flip side of that, it can create pretty abusive men as well. Right? Yeah. They are told that this is how their wife, the doctrine says women are supposed to submit to them, right? And once you're married, a lot of women are told it's your divine purpose to have sex with your husbands, and a lot of men embody that and take that on. So I think it's very real. I also would say too, and I mean this and I don't put blame on the men for this because I think it's just a recipe for disaster, but a lot of women experience assault on their wedding night because of Mormon purity culture, because neither one of them, like the like male or female partner, has understood or learned anything about their body, and they are taught that like once you get married you can just have sex and you can jump into it, but that's not how we know that's not how sex works, right?
Yeah.
So it's just, that's I think a really horrific consequence of Mormon purity culture. It's something I've worked with several clients on.
For people who don't know, Ashley and I both watch some reality TV, including Secret Lives of Mormon Wives. And so as we're recording, season 3 just got done. I know they're filming a season 4, but one of the storylines, of course, was a cheating quote unquote scandal where there was an emotional affair that happened with one of the women and another man. And I think like 2 kisses or something like that. And so this was a storyline. That particular couple grew up in the Mormon church. They are no longer a part of it. However, as they were processing this on camera, obviously what came out was a lot of emotional abuse. And I think so much of it tied to the way, the patriarchal standards of the LDS faith. But he would say over and over, I just feel so emasculated. I feel so emasculated. And if you took a shot every time he said that, you would be drunk in like 5 minutes, because that was like his theme. Like, I feel emasculated because my wife did this thing to me. And it struck me that like 2 things. A, just like how that shame lived in his body, even though he hadn't been a part of the church for, I think, over a decade at that point. But also then having no other language to organize what he's feeling, and all he could do was then like externalize it onto his wife, like, you've done this thing to me. Like, really what you're feeling is shame, and really but because you can't sit with it, then you're actually perpetuating this cycle of abuse by not taking responsibility for how did we get to this place. And the fact that she's telling you, here's why I did it. It's because of this abuse. And it all had to be externalized. And there's just no language or understanding of any emotional pieces for men. Maybe that's a generalized statement, but it's something that I noticed.
Yeah, I think that the way he responded to something is, I could see a lot of LDS men responding in that way. Absolutely. Yeah. I think that, and also too, that scenario and her kissing, the 2 kisses, I think also is Mormon purity culture on display.
Yes,
because
totally.
It's like, I'm not saying that she should be kissing. I'm not saying that you should kiss someone who's not your partner. But it is being displayed that she had like a full-on sexual affair for years. And it's like, guys, it's 2 kisses. And I'm not saying that that's okay, but it's not what it's being blown out of proportion to be. Yeah. But that to me is Mormon purity culture on display.
Yes, I
right?
totally agree.
And that's part of his reactivity as well.
Yeah. Like the response and the shame is like very disproportionate to what the original offense was.
Yes. It also relates to the whole swinging thing that wasn't actually swinging. Remember?
Yes.
Season 1?
Yeah. The whole reason they got popular, for this like soft swinging. And you're like, oh, it reminded me of like, I listened to a lot of recap podcasts, and they're like blown away. Like, oh my gosh, how are 30-year-old Mormon women acting this way? And it just, in so many ways, it's like they miss so much developmental pieces in terms of like relational, social, intellectual, spiritual, physical, like all of these developmental milestones that people outside of a high control religion may go through at a much younger age. Like, that is all missed in high control religion. And so then, yes, you have a 30-year-old woman who's a mother and been married for 10 or 12 years acting out in these ways. It's because they've never got to go through that, right? And it's like they're acting like college students because that's about where they're at. And I remember experiences in my own life where I felt the exact same way, where I was 32 acting like I was 22 because I just had missed so much.
Absolutely. I think that's another thing we could say is, and I think this is probably true for like a lot of purity cultures, right? It stunts that developmental piece when and especially for that show, it's like Utah is the predominant religion. Like, this is how so many people are presenting. And this is just a case study for Mormonism in a way. Not that I say like this is how traditional Mormons live their life, But the issues and the things that are presented in that show are very on brand for Mormon culture and one that grew up in this system.
Yes. Love reality TV for these reasons.
It's great.
Yeah, I admittedly have not seen that show, but I have heard a lot of folks talking about it. So I kind of feel like I've seen it, at least a little bit. So. Yeah. I'm curious too, and this kind of ties into everything we are talking about, just, purity culture, marriage, and all of that too. But what kinds of sexualized messaging get embedded under the surface, like even when they're framed as like family values?
Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by that?
So like in the Mormon church, like family values, you get married young, you start having kids, things like that. But that's also extremely sexualizing as well, right? Especially for women, because then your entire purpose becomes to just like pump out babies and, give your husband sex whenever he wants so that he won't cheat on you. So yeah, like what kind of messages are embedded, as, or, quote unquote family value messages that are actually just really sexualized messages of, women or men in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you named a really big one. I know so many women when they get married from the matriarchs in their family, they are told, okay, when you get married, it will be like you always have to give your husband sex. Whenever he asks for sex, you always give it to him. They are not like consent is not a thing. Saying no is not a thing. Right. And so I think, but they're normalized. And then also too, that you are going to be a very sexual being once you are married. You're going to want to have a lot of sex. That like God designed you to have sex. He's told you to repress it for 20 years, but now you're going to be able to do it. Right. So I think there's this huge misconception about what sex is and what sex is going to look like when you do get married.
Yeah, that makes sense. Interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I know even outside of the LDS church, I definitely heard the languaging around being a submissive wife. I heard that a lot growing up. I mean, I was even a guy, so it wasn't like they were talking to me, but that just speaks to how much that was pushed, I think, and of course, sex was part of it. And so, yeah, unfortunately, that's a very widespread messaging, I think. I also want to ask some questions, specifically how Mormon purity culture impacts survivors. So first up, how does the intersection of Mormon theology and childhood sexual abuse affect survivors differently than like in other high control systems?
I think because you start learning, I mean, I'm sure actually you learn doctrine at a very young age in all religion, but there's very specific lessons too that Mormon women receive around sex and sexuality and sexual behavior. And I think that those lessons, especially when you're a survivor of child sexual abuse, can make you already feel that you're impure and can make you feel that you've already broken the law of chastity. And how are you supposed to navigate that? I think also too, there is just like this huge message from your male priesthood leaders in the church, if you confess to them, or just in general, that like women are not supposed to be sexual at all. Like they're not supposed to be kissing multiple boys. They're not supposed, and because I think of that policing nature of it, it just embeds so differently if you're already a survivor of sexual abuse. Like you already have so much shame, and now you're a part of a culture that is policing your sexuality from a very young age. And not just the religious doctrine. Everyone in the congregation is also policing your sexuality.
Yeah.
And I would imagine that's probably very similar, though. Like I'm thinking about other high control religion and just the messaging. Like I would imagine the feelings are very similar. I think the problem is a lot of like there's no training at all for clergy, and that goes from leadership all the way to like people running primary and Sunday school, right? They're just all volunteers. And so how someone delivers a doctrine is not trauma informed. And that is like probably my biggest argument. And I'm not saying that training means it is going to be trauma informed, but I think the chances of the doctrine being taught improperly are very high, with their own spin, their own metaphors. And if you're a survivor, how you interpret that can be really damaging.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and we've talked about this in other ways before too, but like, especially with those worthiness interviews, when you have the childhood sexual abuse, then you have these worthiness interviews. There's so much grooming that is just then becomes the norm. it just sets you up for further abuse down the road. And this is like, as an aside, I looked this up in Utah the other day, like what is the age of consent in Utah around like legality, and 16 is the age of consent, which that's actually pretty typical for like most states or whatever. You can consent at the age of 16. But Utah has a Romeo and Juliet law that, somebody up to 10 years older than you, as long as you're 16, up to 10 years older than you, so 26 years old, that is legal. Like you can, as long as the 16-year-old is consenting, that 26-year-old can be technically even married to that person, but for sure just having sex with them. And I think about that too. And like, going back to our, Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, there is a couple where they had a pretty significant age discrepancy, 16 and 21, when they got together and she got pregnant. And though it is legal in Utah and normalized in Utah, I feel like it can have so many ramifications that you just aren't even aware of at the time. That like, were you really able to consent at 16? And like all those things.
Absolutely. And also too, like the person you're talking about is a sexual abuse survivor. And so
Right. Yeah.
of course she ended up in this like power dynamic relationship,
Mhm.
right? And I also think too, as a sexual abuse survivor and you're going to these bishops' interviews and they're asking the questions of, are you morally clean? And you're being exposed to that every time you like need to hit a certain milestone in the church. I think we can only imagine what's happening internally. And I think some people are going to confess, right? Some people are going to be like, well, so-and-so touched me. And some people are going to not, and they're going to take that in. And so it's so complex and complicated, and it's so formalized. Like that is normal, standardized practice. Everyone goes to talk to their bishops. Like there's no one that doesn't do that. And you have to do that. So if you don't do that, you can't participate in certain rituals within the church.
Yeah. Yeah. So kind of on that note then, how do you think like teachings around like perfectionism, worthiness, repentance get weaponized against survivors, childhood sexual abuse survivors, or, kind of being groomed in that system?
Well, I think it goes to what I was saying earlier. Like you have to write. Like I've actually heard of survivors that have been disfellowshipped. I've heard of survivors that have received like the same, like where they can't take the sacrament, they have to repent, they have to write a letter of forgiveness to their perpetrators. Like they're treated in a way that they have like committed sexual sin themselves.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And again, it's terrible. It's and we call it in Utah the bishop roulette, because you might get a bishop who's incredible and like would never do anything like that and would never ask any, like would call authorities, right? But then you don't get a bishop like that. I've heard both. I've heard great stories and I've heard horror stories, and that to me is such a systemic issue. And also what makes like the impact of purity culture unique is some people are going to be totally fine.
Sure. Yeah.
You know what I
That's
mean?
the
Like
subjective nature of it. Yeah.
some people aren't going
Trauma.
to have that. I mean, I would say that when I say totally fine, I still think it's just so grossly inappropriate when a bishop is asking those questions. Like I think about my bishop that I confess to, who is a wonderful man. And I've known him like my whole life, right? And he was a childhood friend's dad. But I should have still never been telling him that.
Right.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
He should have never been giving me like, he should have been like, okay, we need to call your mom, or we need to go talk to the school counselor, right? Like that should have been how it was addressed. Instead I got a punishment. And I think that's the problem. But he was a great man. And so I'm like, as a sexual abuse survivor, what if I would have had a different bishop? How would have that gone?
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah.
On that note, just all of the stuff that we've been talking about, like internalized shame and fear, I would just want to ask, how do people who do leave Mormonism often carry internalized shame or fear, even years after leaving?
I think it shows up in a lot of different ways. I think especially shows up in how they see themselves and feel about themselves. I actually, like, speaking of Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, I think when we watched that season 3, and Jessie, right, she's in the therapist's office, and the therapist asks, like, what do you like about yourself? And she goes, nothing. I don't like anything about myself. I think there's a lot of self-hatred that comes with this. And not trusting your body and not trusting your physical sensations. I think, right, you don't ever feel like you're achieving what you need to be achieving. And then on top of it,
Yeah.
if you have broken any of the rules, then you're really not. So
Mm-hmm.
I think it comes with a lot
Yeah.
of self, sure.
Yeah. As we move into like some of the healing pieces of this, what are some of the somatic patterns you've seen in clients or even like Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, who've survived Mormon purity culture and or sexual abuse? How is that showing up for them still, even if they're
Yeah.
not cognitively in it?
I would say I see, like, I think this response makes a lot of sense. I see a lot of fawning, a lot of appeasement and people pleasing, right? And I have to be very cognizant of that in my sessions with clients because it's a perceived power dynamic, and they're like,
Yeah.
they're like seeing me as an authority figure because I think fawning and appeasement is often how you survive like a high control religion. I also see a lot of freeze as well, where they freeze up and they'll literally freeze up in our sessions, like not knowing what to do or where to go, right? Because that physiology is also very much a survival skill. I think a lot of panic attacks also, like I work with a lot of clients who have gone through the LDS temple and have experienced a lot of panic in that setting. And it's very much a freeze response because they don't feel safe to leave and they're also unsafe to stay. So right? A lot of panic. I feel like body image also, like a lot of body image issues and just not liking the way your body looks. And that can lead to obviously like disordered eating and also like a lot of body dysmorphia as well.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. What are some of the specific healing practices or therapeutic approaches that you have found most helpful, both for yourself, but also for clients? Like what are some of the things that are most effective?
Absolutely. So I do a body-based approach to therapy called brain spotting, where I work directly with people's nervous system and their neurophysiology. And I have witnessed clients have such tremendous results with that. I think, right? Because it's also what I love about brain spotting is it really takes me out of that authority figure role. It's very client led. So you're going into your own physiology and curiously exploring and following those threads, and you're coming to your own felt sense of what do I need? What does my resilience look like? And I think that approach, whether that's via brain spotting or any type of therapy modality, is very important. Like letting them be the expert of themselves. And obviously that's going to be uncomfortable when you're stepping outside of high control religion. But hey, can we just notice that this feels uncomfortable? I'm right here with you while you're navigating that uncertainty. Because the moment, and I'm not saying I'm imperfect, right? But the moment I step into that authority figure, it's like we're just playing out those same dynamics again. So I think I think a body-based approach and brain spotting specifically has been really supportive in helping me support these clients and this population because it does come from within. I actually had a client last week and she was like, I was talking to my family and they were asking me if you had given me all these techniques. And I actually said, no, I've been learning how to do all of this myself. And I'm like, that is the goal. Like, that's what we want, right? For you to feel more regulation in your system and in different environments. But I also think I work with a lot of clients, outside of doing like the nervous system work is I think establishing a relationship with yourself because you don't have that. You're, especially in a high control religion, your spiritual relationship with God comes before everything. And so, doing specific practices that allow them to build a relationship with themselves. And sometimes it's as simple as helping them understand the various emotions that are happening in their body and building like emotional intelligence, right? And I think another component too is helping them carve out a community and finding community. I think that's essential when you leave a high control religion like Mormonism. And unfortunately in Utah, those spaces are very hard to come by because the religion is so predominant. So kind of like seeking like-minded people out, groups, like communities that are more diverse has been a huge component in helping people navigate this, especially in such a condensed like religious area.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you kind of mixed it in there a little bit, like the relationship with like your body, or how Mormonism can oftentimes take you away from your body. What would you say to a client or listener who is wanting to rebuild a relationship with their body or pleasure after purity culture? How do they start that?
I would say start very slow. I also recommend starting with sensations that are safer to feel in your body.
Yeah.
Right. And I think curiosity is probably something I say a million times in my office, but just being really open and curious. And even if you can just notice for 1 second how something feels,
Mm-hmm.
and then moving on is okay, but go slow and don't push yourself, because I think sometimes what happens, especially when people leave, they go from like 0 to 100, and then that can be just as traumatizing as over here.
Yeah.
And so I think I also, maybe this is my personal sexuality journey, but I love reading spicy novels, and I think it's a really good way to kind of tap into that piece in a safer way that's not you doing it, right? But you're reading it and you're imagining. But also that can feel really threatening too, I think, when you've never been allowed to feel certain things in your body. And I think it's not about getting upset at yourself for that. It's like, okay, this is hard. And so when you are activated, doing something to regulate yourself. And I think that like noticing the felt sense of regulation in your body, and whether that means, okay, well, I feel really activated in like my stomach. It feels so icky right now, but my feet are on the floor and I can feel grounded in my feet. Can I notice what that feels like? And sometimes that's even too hard to notice your feet. So then doing something else to take care of yourself, right? I think it's like just this ebb and flow of that, but going slow. And I also love, like, that's why I love movement and exercise, and not even exercise in the sense to like lose weight, but like, oh, can I feel my muscle right now? Like that can feel that can be safer to feel than like word of sadness. Like, but oh, my tricep muscle is lifting this weight. Can I notice what my triceps doing right now? Do you know what I'm saying? So like,
Yes.
finding something like that, or my legs are walking. What are the muscles in my legs doing to support me? How are my ankles holding me up? So it can be as simple as that. You don't need to like go full blown masturbation.
Yeah. 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 I know. I feel like too much of a good thing is still too much, right? Like, and I think it's so tempting to like just jump into things like that, which is like maybe the goal, right? Or who knows, whatever. But I think, going slow, because if we're overriding our nervous system, we're just going to get the same response as when we did when it was too much on the other side of the spectrum. So yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I love it.
This is so relevant for so many people, not just Mormonism, but when it comes to boundaries and dealing with families and communities and all of that. So, I just wanted to ask you, how can survivors of Mormon purity culture begin to set boundaries with family or religious communities who do still uphold all of these high control systems we've been talking about?
Yeah. Great question. I don't know if have you guys read the book of Boundaries by Melissa Urban before? Have you heard of it?
I've heard of it. I haven't read it. Is it good? I mean, that's how I learned how to do curl patterns from. So maybe I need to learn boundaries from her too.
I think I have mine loaned out right now. But why I love it, and I think she actually has a section on religion and politics in there, is she gives you actual scripts. And so she gives you like a green boundary, a yellow, and a red. And I think it can be really empowering, because I think, first of all, for a lot of people, I think boundaries can feel very daunting, especially when you don't know what that even means or what that looks like. And also, too, because we're talking about, and I've learned so much of this from you too, Laura, like we're talking about people whose religion is their entire identity, and they are not going to understand your decision to leave or step away or not believe, or the impact purity culture has had on you. And so I think you have to be really cognizant of like, what type of dynamic do I want to get in with them? And I also don't think that means you have to be completely estranged from them either. And that's what I really love about her book, is it empower you to kind of set some specific boundaries in a way that is for you and not for them. And it also kind of models safety too. And so a lot of times I'll do that with clients, is like, we'll kind of pull out the book together. We'll talk about a specific scenario that's happening, and they'll be like, okay, what's a green boundary? What's a yellow? What's a red?
Yeah. I love that. It's so empowering.
So empowering. So I recommend that book. And I don't have it memorized to tell you what specific thing happens in each category. That's why I'm not telling you. That's why I'm referencing that book.
I'll definitely
I love it. Well, I'll make sure, I'll put it in the show notes so that people can reference that. One of the things we talked about a little bit in the first part of your interview, and you've mentioned it, kind of here and there, is just like the role that community and relationships can play, or how important that was for you in your own healing. So thinking about that with people coming out of high control religions, Mormonism, what is the role that community and relationships play in helping them release shame and then even reclaim self-trust?
I just think there's something incredibly powerful about finding a group of people that just accept you for who you are and how you show up.
Mhm.
And obviously, it's not that black and white. I think it's also really, I think it's really scary. And I want to say that when you do this, it's not going to feel comfy. You're going to feel super
Yeah.
uncomfortable. You're going to have to get out of your comfort zone and you're going to have to meet people and ask questions and put yourself in new situations, and it's not going to feel regulating. Like, I think it will feel
Mhm.
dysregulating, and that's also a part of the process. And I think really kind of starting to understand what vulnerability means, and being vulnerable is not weak. And it's also a double-edged sword because you're going to take some chances and they're not going to work out, right? People are going to let you down. And
Mhm.
also, you're also going to figure out who your people are, in my opinion, by putting yourself out there. I like to encourage people to start at like coffee shop. This is obviously on brand for
Yes.
Utah, but like coffee shops, since coffee is not allowed, right? Like coffee shops.
Yeah.
I really like if there's pottery classes or art classes or a workout studio, like a yoga studio is great. Just the kind of thinking outside of the box where you have a group of people that are coming together and it's something you enjoy doing too.
Mhm.
I think it's so incredibly important though to start to build that, because you learn that, and I feel this especially, that when you grow up in a high control religion, you're taught like this is the only place you can feel joy. These are the only people who
Yeah.
really get it, who understand. And then you get out and you're like, this person's so happy and they don't go to church ever. Like you start to
Yeah.
see the world for what it is. And that diversity is incredibly healing. And I think it's uncomfortable. I remember feeling uncomfortable. I did not know how to make friends. After I left Utah, I was like, I don't know how to make friends. I didn't ever have to. I just knew everyone. And it's super uncomfortable. But when you can, it's like working out a muscle. The more you
Mhm.
practice, the easier it gets. And the connection to me is like far outweighs the hard that comes with it.
Hmm.
Yeah. I get that. That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. What do you hope people reimagine when they begin to step outside of these narrow scripts that they were given?
Oh, just like possibility. I think there's so much possibility outside of
Mm.
high control religion, and just also like what it's like to live your life from your own um self-trust and your own desires and your own
Mm.
instincts. And I think that's complex and complicated and hard. And I think I don't think we're ever fully certain at any point in our life, but I think that's like also religion claims certainty, but they don't have it either. Like no one has certainty, right? Like
Mhm.
they're really good at being like,
Mhm.
this is what's going to happen when you die. But I'm like, no one knows what
Yeah.
happens when you die, right? So I think like
Exactly.
this opportunity to live right here, right now, and especially like when you're coming out of something like Mormonism. I mean, I'm sure every religion, but obviously I just know Mormonism so well. So much emphasis is put on the afterlife and getting to the highest level of heaven. And these are
Yeah.
all the things that you have to do that you're not even living
Yes.
right here,
Mhm.
right now in the moment. And I think that life gets really beautiful when all that noise isn't happening. And you're just like, okay, today is enough.
Mhm.
I'm enough right here. And if I'm not checking all my boxes for church, it's okay, And I think
I love
also
that.
too, the possibility, because the possibility of defining, because I think this is important, what your spirituality looks like and what your relationship with God looks like. If you believe in God, I wouldn't necessarily say God, but like something bigger than myself. It's like I want to also say, because I think people are scared when they leave that they're not going to have that, but I think it's absolutely
Yeah.
possible to define from within what that relationship with a higher power looks like. And no one
Mhm.
holds the keys to that but you. And I think that
Yeah.
becomes a reality when you are no longer confined by the system.
Yeah, I love that. It's totally spot on. Yeah, there's so many possibilities, which is kind of scary sometimes and then can
Terrifying.
become like exhilarating. So I'm all about it. Yeah. Well, this has been an incredible conversation, but as we wrap up, we have just a couple more questions. And one of them is just kind of what gives you hope about how this conversation is shifting? Like especially in the Mormon or ex-Mormon communities, just like being able to talk about all of this.
Yeah, I think about this often. I think about even like my platform and my page. I was telling I don't know if it was my mom. I think it was my mom. I was like, Mom, when I went to high school, no one was talking about this. No one was
Yeah.
saying you could leave Mormonism. No one was saying you could not believe in it, or right, or like the impact purity culture had. It was just like this. No one was talking about it. And I think in the age of social media and people coming forward and sharing their stories and podcasts like this, it's shifting. Right.
Yeah.
That you're not alone anymore. And I think that's always my hope. If this reaches one person that's maybe questioning or struggling or hating themselves because they're not sexually pure, that they know they're not alone and there's nothing wrong with them. And I really see that shifting. I know the Secret Lives of Mormon Wives get a lot of criticism, but it is literally putting Mormonism on the big screen, just like Surviving Mormonism is. Like all of this stuff that's been done in the dark and has been historically very hush hush is coming to light, and that gives me a lot of hope for change, but also for people to be like, I don't have to live like this anymore.
Yeah. That's huge. I
No,
love that.
that really is. What is one healing truth or practice that you wish every survivor of Mormon purity culture could know today?
I'm gonna be like, that it's all bullshit. Like that's what I'm saying. I don't know if that's politically correct. I mean, I think like you can't convince me that this like all-knowing, all-powerful being gave us these parts of our body that were supposed to be covered up and not like used and explored and experienced. I don't believe that. And I think that I've really come to embody that in my own healing and my own journey, and also in watching so many people reclaim that relationship with their body. And I'm not even just talking about sexually, but just like feeling comfortable in your own skin, and like I can wear a tank top and oh my gosh, like this is the most freeing feeling. Like it was always about control. It was always about like taking advantage of that part of you. And so sorry, I don't know if that's politically correct, but that's what it is. That's my truth.
I
No,
mean, I don't disagree. Yeah. I love it. Well, once again, this has been such an incredible conversation. I'm just really grateful to have you on here to speak not only from personal experience, but also professional experience. And I hope that everybody can walk away either with a greater understanding of purity culture in the LDS church, or like some steps for healing and how to navigate out of it, because I think that is just so important. Thank you for being here. And again, for people who haven't listened to the first episode, go listen to Ashley share her own story. But if people want to get in touch with you, follow along with your work, social media, or maybe even work with you, where can they find you?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram at AshleyB_therapy. I also am on TikTok too, same handle. I forgot to mention that.
Nice.
I'm like dabbling in the TikTok arena.
Love
Also,
it.
you can just check out my website, ashleybucknerlmft.com. Happy to connect with you on there. And yeah, thank you guys so much
Perfect.
for having me. I love this conversation.
Yeah. It's awesome. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for
Yes.
doing
I'll
it.
make sure that I put all of your information in the show notes so people can quickly access it. But yes, I just echo, like, thank you for being here and such a great conversation.
Thank you once again to Ashley Buckner for being such an incredible guest. It's so wonderful to have somebody who's well-versed in the LDS faith and working with clients coming out of the LDS faith on the podcast. So I'm just really grateful for Ashley being here. If you want to get in touch with Ashley, you can follow her on Instagram. You can check out her website. All of her information is in the show notes below, but just wanted to reiterate how grateful we are to have Ashley on the podcast. So with that, all God's people said, Amen.
Amen.